I think it's important to think about this when you get overwhelmed in your business. What are some ways that you can make it easier on yourself? Is having a virtual assistant actually helpful or not? And what are some of the pros and cons that you don't hear people talking about? Hi, this is Caroline from Happy Sensitive Self-Employed. In this video, I want to walk you through pros and cons of hiring a virtual assistant when you're self-employed. Now, I decided to make this video because when I was Googling this, when I was researching this, I kept coming across article after article after article after article after article after article after article written by virtual assistant agencies. They're all saying you should definitely get a virtual assistant. It's the best thing you'll ever do. And if you don't do it, you're kind of crazy. That's what all these articles boil down to. So it's super annoying. So even the articles you find that are, like what are the cons or downsides to hiring a virtual assistant, they'll say something like, well, if you're a total control freak and you want to do everything yourself, then don't get a virtual assistant. But if you're a smart entrepreneur, you should get one, right? So there's not much of a balanced discussion on this online at the moment. Hopefully that'll change, but right now that's the way it is. So I wanted to provide a more balanced perspective. I have worked with virtual assistants for several years. I've had 3.5, I'll explain the half later, over time. And there are some definite pros and cons to this. And right now I don't have a virtual assistant, and right now I'm choosing not to have one. Okay, so what are the benefits? Well, the benefits obviously are that when you have a virtual assistant, you can outsource some of the stuff that you really, really hate doing, or that just takes up a lot of your time and kind of cuts up your workday in a way that's not a very efficient use of your time. So a virtual assistant can take tasks off your plate that if you had to do them yourself, they would be distracting. Things like, you're really in the flow, you're doing what you're good at, but now you have to log into some software and do 5 minutes of a task because it needs to be done today, and they have to switch back to what you were doing before. Those kinds of switches take up a lot of brain space, and it takes a long time to get back into what you were doing before. So having a virtual assistant take care of those little tasks, even though they may only be doing a few hours of tasks at most, it can really save a lot of time for you because you don't have to switch back and forth and do all those little things. So that's one, right? So those little tasks that you need to do that you have to stay on top of, but basically anybody could do them, and it really cuts into your focus and your schedule for the day. Those are great to hand over to a virtual assistant. Another thing would be if you're just not very good at it, but there's a downside to this, and you'll hear people talk about this in different ways. Some people say, if you're really bad at something, hand it over to a virtual assistant. Get someone else to do it for you, or hire a contractor, right? Like it could be a very specialized person who only does that one specific task for you, but hand it over. But there's also a lot of people who say, well, no, you can't do that because before you can hand it over, you need to be able to do it yourself because, when push comes to shove, you have to be able to do it yourself. And also you need to know what to tell the person that they should be doing. There's something to say for both of these ways of reasoning. But I think ultimately, if you really hate doing something and you're not very good or fast at it, but you have a basic understanding of how the task needs to be done, it makes sense to hand it over to someone else. It does. A lot of people, when they talk about hiring a virtual assistant, they'll talk about you staying in your zone of genius. Right? So the whole idea is that you as an entrepreneur, you as a business owner, you need to be doing what you're really, really good at, what your clients are paying you for, and you should stay away from all the little drudge tasks that you don't, that are not your expertise. Because you should be in your zone of genius like all the time. That's the reasoning, right? And that sounds really good, but here's the downside to that. You can't be in your zone of genius all the time. If you have a zone of genius, something you're really, really good at, chances are that thing or those things are also what costs you the most energy. It takes a massive amount of focus, right? If you're really good at something, you're not just, you are actually really, really focused and on target with it. And so you won't be able to do it for a full day. This is something that people forget when they talk about this. I don't think, from personal experience, I don't think that it's possible to set up your day so that you're constantly getting stuff done in your zone of genius and that somebody else does like the easy stuff for you. What I found is that actually you need a balance. And I've had conversations with people, whether self-employed or working at a job, who had actually quite an important job that they were doing, and they said, but I actually like doing some of the copy paste. I like doing some of this dumb stuff. I like doing some of those simple tasks, because when you do those simple tasks, your mind gets to process things in the background. You get to kind of think about stuff, kind of like, when you're in the shower and you get these great ideas, is because you're not doing anything that requires your full attention or that's really intense. You're just kind of in the shower and then suddenly, boom, something comes to mind. It can work the same way when you are doing something that's kind of, a bit of a tedious task or a repetitive task, or it can be fun, but it's not very important. Those tasks can actually help get you into a flow where suddenly you're kind of processing stuff in the background and suddenly you have an idea of like, oh, this is what I should do. Also, it's a little bit unrealistic, I think, to expect that every day you're going to be in your zone of genius. You're going to wake up some days and be like, oh, I can barely do anything today. And you just know it. You just know that you're kind of tired, or your mind is all over the place, and you're not going to be able to do any of that amazing stuff that you could do in your zone of genius. It's just not going to happen today. So those days, it's actually really great to just have some Excel sheets that you need to update, or some social media graphics that you need to make. So you can still do something, but you don't have to do the big, difficult stuff. Because zone of genius or not, you're not going to be able to do it today. So that's the downside to outsourcing things to a virtual assistant. If you outsource all the kind of simple, repetitive stuff to a virtual assistant, then those days when you're not feeling so great and you kind of need something simple to do, there's nothing you can do. So you either do nothing, or you try to force yourself into a task that you're really not going to be able to do today. So I think that is a downside that is really overlooked. And that's one of the reasons why I am actually choosing to not have a virtual assistant right now. I'm actually giving myself some space to do some of those little bit tedious tasks to balance out the intense work that I do, the work that I can't just hand over to someone else. But to create a bit more of a, intense, focused, expert work balance with simple, I could do it with one hand tied behind my back. I'm doing something, but I'm not exhausting myself. I'm not working very hard at it. I'm just kind of playing around with some things. So that's important to keep in mind. I think it's unrealistic to expect yourself to always be doing like super high quality work and only be doing the stuff that you're paid a lot for per hour. There's going to be times, there's going to be days, there's going to be hours where no matter how much time you have to do it, you're not going to be in that zone where you can actually do those things. Now here's some other things about hiring a virtual assistant that can make things more difficult than it seems at first. My ideal of hiring a virtual assistant would be that this is someone who comes into my business, takes over certain tasks, and those tasks are completely off of my plate. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to follow up on it. I know this person's taking care of it. That's a great ideal. And I've heard other people talk about this too. I've heard other business owners say that is why they would want a virtual assistant. And that if their virtual assistant can't be that person, what's the point, right? And yeah, there's something to that. Because in practice, what I found is, and I've worked with 3 virtual assistants long-term, like one after the other, meaning I think the shortest was like 6 months and the longest has been like maybe 2.5 years, something like that. And even if somebody has the same tasks that they need to do over and over, you still need to check their work. You still need to check their work because they're people and they're going to make mistakes and they're going to do something one way for a while, and then who knows why, suddenly they start doing it differently and they don't realize it, and without someone to correct them, they're going to do it this new way and they're going to do this task wrong and they're not going to notice. Virtual assistants are not feeling that level of responsibility for your business that you do. They're contractors. They have other clients. They're just, getting tasks ticked off. They're just getting things done, right? And so you are the one who's ultimately responsible for whatever they do. So what this means is that when you hand the task over to a virtual assistant, there's a few different steps. One is you need to map out what they need to do and communicate that to them. Then you need to think about how long will they have to complete this task. And in thinking about that, you need to think ahead and say, okay, you can't just say, I need it by Friday, so you have until Friday. No, because what if they hand it in and it's not done well? There's a mistake or there's something they need to do over. So you need to factor that in when you set the deadline. You need to have enough time that you can review the task, give them any updates on what they need to change, and that they can still complete it in time. Okay, so you have this multi-pronged scheduling suddenly when you're dealing with a virtual assistant. That is different when you do it yourself. When you do it yourself, you probably think, oh, I need to do this thing. You just go do it that same day and it's done, right? Whereas if you hand it over, map out the steps, give the person a deadline, follow up with them, make sure they actually do it on time, which also is not necessarily guaranteed, and then check that it's done right. Ideally, but not necessarily in practice, but ideally a virtual assistant, because they are a human being, they can assess and decide what needs to be done when. So they can kind of look at a complex task and say, hey, this actually needs to be done this way and this needs to be done that way. Even when you can't give them full 100% predictable rules, you can't tell them if this then that always. You can just tell them, look, you're gonna have to evaluate and assess based on this, do that, and you're gonna have to kind of look and see. In theory, a virtual assistant would be great for that. But in practice, what I found is that pretty much all virtual assistants, they have this mindset where they're just like, do the task, follow all the steps, get it done. And they're very quick that way, but they don't like it when you give them a task where they have to think. And typically, when they have to think about it, they're not going to think about it. They're just going to crank out a template, or they're going to turn your instructions into some kind of hard and fast rule, and they're just going to do it that way all the time. Even though what you wanted is for a human being to assess a situation and actually come up with, what is best in this particular situation. A lot of virtual assistants don't think that way, and they aren't really set up to work with tasks that way. You might need to have somebody working for you who's working at a higher level and who comes at a price point that comes with that. But what I found is that even though I would expect that, and if I were a virtual assistant, I would like getting tasks where I'm expected to kind of think through and assess what's the best option here. But what I found working with virtual assistants, like, they don't think that way. They just want you to tell them exactly what to do and they'll just do it, but they're not going to think about what they're doing. So that also means if you give a task to a virtual assistant, stupid things can go very, very wrong because they don't have that reflective thinking turned on. They're just focused on doing it quickly and getting it done, but they're not thinking about what they're doing per se. They're not thinking about whether it makes sense. So even though it's good to tell your assistant about why you're giving them the task and what you're expecting from them and the bigger picture, just because you tell them about the bigger picture doesn't mean they're actually gonna take that into account. And this brings me to why I've decided right now to not work with a virtual assistant, because what I would want a person for in my business is those complex tasks that need human assessment. But in practice, what I found is that virtual assistants don't really think that way anyway, and that I end up having to create some kind of template for them or some kind of if this then that rule. Now the problem is, once you do that, once you can say if this then that, a lot of those tasks can actually be automated. There are a lot of really great tools like Zapier and tools like Zapier, but also there's all these new technologies coming up where it's made easier and easier to just automate something. So if you have to define your tasks to that very, very nitty-gritty level where a virtual assistant can do it, chances are there is a way to automate that and just have technology do it. And technology is typically more reliable, it's cheaper, and you have full control over what happens where. It takes some time to set it up, but once it's set up, the process is just going to run. So that's something I'm doing now in my business. I'm looking at what are some of the repetitive tasks that I can turn into an artificial intelligence process in some way, and then that's just going to do it for me. And that's just going to become more and more of a thing over time. And I think, in a way, a lot of virtual assistants, agencies and virtual assistants are shooting themselves in the foot right now because they're set up to expect their employer to give them very, very clear step-by-step steps. Whereas once you've got that set up as an employer, chances are you can automate it. And there's already so much possible right now. 5 years down the line, who knows what we can do through automations. Because all your tools that you use when you're working online, a lot of these, you can use integrations, you can set up all these little rules, and you don't have to be a programmer to be able to do that. There are more and more tools that will help you do it for you, where you just have to say, okay, when this gets added there, I want that to happen in this app. I want this program to take that information and turn it into that. I even have something set up right now where I have an Excel sheet where I just put text into the Excel sheet, and I have software that automatically turns it into images. And then adds that to another Excel sheet. I can download the Excel sheet in one go and upload it to my social media scheduler. So suddenly I have a process where all I have to do is think about what I want on the poster, and the rest is just done for me. That's amazing. That's amazing. And there's more processes like that. So that kind of does that automation, does that assistant work for me. But at the same time, it's something that I can program. It's something that is oftentimes more reliable than an actual human being who's going to make mistakes and forget things and overlook things. It's going to be more cost efficient. And in some ways, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to do that. And I know that I won't have to follow up at multiple steps of the process. I know that once it's running successfully, and the artificial intelligence is not going to suddenly do something else, right? It's set up to do that thing. Okay, now lastly, if you've never worked with a virtual assistant before, would I recommend working with a virtual assistant? Actually, I would, and here's why. Regardless of whether you find it useful in the long run, when you hire a virtual assistant, you are forced to think about your processes. You are forced to stop doing things on the fly. You have to stop just improvising. You have to think about what is the system, what is the repetitive system that is going to get this done. And so you have to think about your business in a whole new way. You have to really put yourself in a different mindset. You're going to have to write out procedures. And this is something that you're probably not going to do if it's just you and your business, because you just keep it all up here. You have a few notes here and there, but you're just kind of doing it, in the moment. And while that seems very effective, it's actually a relief when you have processes you can follow, so that when you have a down day or you're a little bit lost and confused about, wait, what am I doing? What was the plan here? You can just follow a process. And like I said, once you have a process, chances are it's easy to automate it too. But to go from doing stuff in your business yourself to figuring out an automation is often hard, because if you've never trained yourself to think in terms of processes and systems and standard operating procedures, that's going to be really hard to just do off the cuff. But if you're kind of trained in that, and if you have someone who's asking you questions or like, I'm not sure what you want me to do here, that's going to teach you how to create those step-by-step processes and how to make them really, really clear. And that's a really valuable skill to learn. Now, there is one more thing I want to say about working with a virtual assistant that I haven't mentioned before, and it's that virtual assistants are obviously people, and they have their own way where they're maybe very open to feedback and maybe other ways that they're not. Now, when you work with a virtual assistant, chances are you never really meet them. You may have a Zoom call with them or some kind of, conversation with them. But chances are a lot of it is going to be done through chat. It's going to be done through just email. And so suddenly you are dealing with a human being who may have an off day or may be upset about something or may find it hard to hear certain things. And you have to guide them and you have to tell them when they've done something wrong, but you have to do it in the way that they can hear. But you don't really know who they are and you don't really understand their personality because you never really talk to them as a person. And in the past, I've tried to kind of prevent that by my first virtual assistant I tried to have regular just calls with her, like once every 2 months, to get on a video call with her for half an hour. But honestly, those were just a total mess. She was always scrambling, and she had a little kid who was always like running around, and like we didn't actually get to talk. So at some point, I just kind of gave it up, and she clearly didn't want it. And so the two other virtual assistants I had after her, one of them explicitly said to me she didn't want to have these kinds of meetings. She just wanted to get the task and do it. And another one I also never talked to in person. So what that means is then when they're not doing a task correctly, you have to give them feedback and tell them what they did wrong, which, as a person, that it's hard to hear when somebody's not happy with your work. So you want to kind of say it in a way that is going to be easier for them to process. But you don't know what that way is because you don't know these people. They're like this anonymous person on the other end of a process, and you give them tasks, but you don't know who they are. So that makes things awkward. And what it's meant for me is that there's been times when I knew I needed to tell my assistant that they screwed up, but I'd had a long day, a lot was going on, and then on top of that, I was like, I don't even know how to have this conversation, and I would just let it slide, which is not good, obviously, but it just felt like that was like another task that I had to do on top of everything else, figure out how to communicate with my virtual assistant about the thing they didn't do well. And the thing is, that conversation is not going to be one moment. It's going to be many moments because you need to communicate that to them, and they might be in a different time zone or working on another task. So they read that and get back to you at a different time, and then you have to pick up the conversation from there. So these communication moments with your virtual assistant can be very drawn out, and they can be very exhausting because you got a virtual assistant so that you could hand over tasks that would otherwise break up your day, right? That's one of the potential reasons. But now your day gets broken up with these important back and forths, communicating over something that needs to be done or needs to be changed. And what I found for myself is when I'm in coaching mode, when I get a notification about an assistant telling me, hey, I'm not sure like what I did wrong, or can you give me more instructions, or I thought I did this, or then I have to switch from coaching mode to that task. And that is the exact switching that I was trying to prevent by getting them to do it, right? So sometimes it really defeats the purpose. The purpose for hiring a virtual assistant is so that you get things off your plate, but now you're still engaged with the task, but on another level. But you still have to switch and think about that. And so there's just many times when it doesn't seem worth it. Some things that, like I said, in theory would work well is when you have a repetitive task that needs to be done every week or every month, and it's always the same thing and always the same way, and it takes quite a lot of time. Then having a virtual assistant do that, in theory is great. In practice, like I said, it could be that they've been doing it right for a year, and then suddenly they start changing what they were doing. This happened with me with one of my assistants. She had been doing a task for like a year, so I just let her do it. I didn't check in with her anymore. And then after about 8 months of not checking in, I found out that she made a terrible mistake, and she'd been doing everything for a certain part of the task completely wrong. And it had to do with communication with clients. So she was suddenly telling clients who had scheduled with me, no, don't do this other thing. And she was telling them to switch platforms. And I was like, oh my God, that's the last thing that I want, right? I don't want a client to schedule something one way and then get an email from my assistant saying, no, you can't do that. You have to do this instead. It's like, no. But that, and she apologized. She felt really bad about it. But the thing is, I'd given her that task to get it off my plate. And for some reason, she got confused about it at some point after she'd been doing it for a while. And I didn't catch it because I stopped checking her. So there's going to be some people say, like, if you have trouble letting tasks go, if you're like a control freak, then don't hire a personal assistant. But I don't think it's that simple. You could be someone who I don't like micromanaging. I try to avoid it at all costs. But what I found is that you kind of need to micromanage an assistant because they could be screwing something up and not realize. And in the end, it's all on you. What happens, it's all on you. So yeah, that can be more trouble than it's worth. Another thing that can happen is I had an assistant once who worked for me for 4 or 5 months and it was great. And then suddenly I got work back that was really messed up. And I was like, the English was really bad and it just didn't make any sense. And I was like, what happened here? And I think, looking back, I think what happened is she probably got a subcontractor to do it for her, but then never checked the subcontractor's work and also didn't ask me for permission to do that, which I would have said no to. So that was weird. And then out of the blue, I got an email from her saying that she was going to work with a big client and she was going to be unavailable for the next few months. So I went from having a virtual assistant to suddenly not having a virtual assistant for a few months. I was like, that's unacceptable. So then I just ended our contract. But you can have things like that happening. And then one time I tried to get an assistant through an agency. I thought, let me stop trying to find someone myself. Let's hire an agency. They know what they're doing. And oh my God, that was a total disaster. It was the worst. I actually had hired someone for a month because I had these monthly contracts. And 3 weeks in, I said, please stop working on all tasks. You will get your extra week of money, but just don't touch any of my work anymore. It was a disaster. And the attitude of the company was that I would need to take my assistant through every single step of the way. Now, when they first mentioned something like that, I interpreted that to mean that, of course, you need to have decent instructions, duh. But this person who they had chosen to work for me, I mean, he had turned on a computer before, but there were so many things he didn't know how to do. And I was like, I cannot teach you that from scratch. And what he expected from me was to get on Skype with him and walk him through every single button click of a task. And so it was driving me insane. It was costing me so much time to try and instruct him. And he would just suddenly go off and do something random. It was just a total mess. And so I canceled the contract. I contacted the company. They said, oh, we'll get you someone else. Her English is really good. Her English was terrible. She did not have a good comprehension of English, and she completed a small task that I gave her to kind of check her out. You know when people speak English so badly that they will write a sentence and the sentence just doesn't mean anything? It's got words in there, but it just doesn't have any meaning. That's what happened with her. So that was even worse. The first guy, at least he spoke decent English, but that was pretty much the only thing. He was good at making graphics. He spoke good English, but everything else was just total disaster. So, it created a lot of stress, and finding a virtual assistant, it can be hard, and you have to have a process for doing that. I would recommend give someone a task to do, because, they can say all the right things, and what counts is whether somebody does a task, does it on time, and does it according to your instructions. I once went through a process where I got, I posted a job on a virtual assistant board, and I got a bunch of people replying, and I selected based on who sounded good, and then I gave them all tiny tasks to do. And one of the ladies, who was very, very full of herself about how great she was, she completely forgot to do the task. So I had my meeting with her, and I was like, I didn't get your task. And she's like, oh, I completely forgot, and I'm sorry, this never happens. Well, it happened now. She had this whole story about how she was babysitting someone, and like, yeah, but that's not, that's not my problem. She just completely forgot to do the task. And when you hire someone to do something, you just kind of give them a first test task, you'll get a sense of what they do and how they do it. Are they going to complete the task on time? Are they going to remember? Are they going to actually follow the instructions, or are they going to go off and do their own thing? Because that's another thing that happened with one person who I thought could be a good fit. She just kind of went off and did her own thing and went against some of my instructions. I was like, that's not going to work. So, eventually I found someone that way. Okay, so when would I recommend working with a virtual assistant? It's when there are things that you need to do, and they're not hard to do, and it would be very easy for someone else to do them, but for whatever reason, you're just not doing them. I had this at some point where whenever I published an article, I was so zapped. I was just like, okay, I've published the article. It was like this end of this long sprint. And then just the thought of having to come up with social media posts to let people know that the article was done. This is one thing too much. And so I would end up just not doing that step, even though I knew it was important to post about the article on social media. So this is one thing that I had a virtual assistant do it for me for quite some time. And it was really helpful, and I was really relieved, and I was like, oh, thank God this is getting done. It was getting done pretty much like clockwork. Of course, sometimes things would go wrong, but overall this was well worth handing over to someone. Now I have a tech solution for that. So I have a very easy way for, I'm using something called Missing Letter, and it's a program that will pull in whenever there's a new article I publish, it'll pull it in, and it'll set up a draft campaign. And I had to set up some things in advance to make that work, but basically I just have to click a few things, and then I've got a bunch of posts that are ready to go out on social. Really great, so, right? So it still solves that problem. But you know, it takes a while to find if there's tech ways to do it. And if you think to yourself, oh, I wish somebody could do this for me, it's not hard, they just have to do it. That could be the kind of thing that would be great to have a virtual assistant do. Another thing that can be great to have a virtual assistant do is when you need to have someone between you and your audience. So for a while, and this is different now, but for a while I got a lot of emails from people who were just like wanting my time and attention, but who didn't want to set up a call and who didn't really want to buy anything. They were just like, hello, like I just want to talk to you over email. And if I told them myself that, you know, please set up an appointment and all that, they just kind of wouldn't listen. They would just kind of keep yapping at me. And so having a virtual assistant who would actually respond for me and just be a little bit of a buffer was really helpful for a while. And so, you know, if you're in a situation like that where you're getting overwhelmed with people reaching out to you, wanting to talk to you, wanting things from you, but they don't actually want to set up an appointment with you, and so you're like, what do they want, and why do they keep emailing back, and why don't they just set up an appointment? And this might be the kind of thing where it's great to have a virtual assistant, because having a virtual assistant answer those emails communicates in no uncertain terms that you are not available to this person, right? If they want to talk to you, they have to set up an appointment. If they just have a question about scheduling or booking or something, it goes through the assistant. So it can be really, really helpful for that, not just for the task load, but psychologically, and just to communicate to people, hey, just because I'm online and just because you can email me doesn't mean I'm available to talk to everyone. Okay, so another reason it can be really helpful to hire a virtual assistant is if you have someone who's just really good at certain things and you're not good at them, or you're decent at them but not great, but they're really good at it, they're fast at it, they're faster at it than you are, right? So if it takes you 30 minutes to do something, it takes your virtual assistant 5 minutes to do something, definitely hire that person to do this task for you. Now in theory, this is what virtual assistant agencies will promote, that's the case, that your virtual assistant will be very efficient and faster at it than you are. In practice, that's not necessarily the case, and you could have a virtual assistant who takes 3 times as long as you do. One of the assistants I worked with, whenever she got a task she didn't quite know how to tackle, she would just spend hours and hours, literally hours, making Excel sheets about what she was going to do. And, you know, so that was like 6 of my billable hours to her that she spent on making an Excel sheet that nothing had been done except make the sheet about what she was going to do. And even when I told her not to do that and not to make Excel sheets, she still did it anyway. I think it was a bit of a nervous thing for her where she was like, I don't know what to do, I'll just make an Excel sheet. So I think the reality of virtual assistants and all the great stuff they can help you with can be really far from, the ideal of virtual assistants, can be really far from the reality of virtual assistants. Like what in theory someone might be able to do for you versus what in practice someone you hire could actually do, that can be miles apart. And so that's really important to keep in mind too when thinking about hiring someone and just kind of assessing what works well, what doesn't. And, you know, for me, having worked with virtual assistants for several years, I've come to a point now where I'm really good at turning my business tasks into processes. And because I'm good at turning them into processes, I'm also good at automating them. And I would rather spend time at this point looking for an automation than go through the hassle of finding someone who can do it for me. Simply because for me, right, I have this ideal that I could have somebody come into my business and actually really help me with stuff and take more and more stuff on their plate. But I've tried that 3 times now and it just hasn't really worked. The guy I hired through the agency who only worked with me for 3 weeks, I'm not counting him in this. That's just, he's the half person, right? So in the 3.5 assistants, he's the half. But, you know, the other assistants I've worked with, they all had their strong points. They're all good at some things. They all had their kind of trip up points as well. But none of them were people who I could see kind of stepping up and doing more with me and for me in my business. And that's why I'm saying I think there is this idea that a virtual assistant is going to be able to do all these things for you, but in practice, mostly they are just human robots, to put it really bluntly. Yes, they have this ability to assess tasks, but they don't want to. They want you to give them the exact steps they need to follow so that they can kind of turn their brain off and just follow the steps. And that's understandable, but I think those jobs are disappearing. Those jobs are, we can have technology do those jobs. So it's less and less necessary to have someone do those things for you, which is why I'm switching now to just having technology do the things that I don't want to do. All right, I hope this was helpful for you. I think it's important to think about this when you get overwhelmed in your business. What are some ways that you can make it easier on yourself? Is having a virtual assistant actually helpful or not? And what are some of the pros and cons that you don't hear people talking about? This is Caroline from Happy Sensitive Self-Employed. If you are self-employed or you want to become self-employed and you're highly sensitive or you're an empath and you're struggling or stuck or overwhelmed, I have some ways that I can help you. Go to my website, happysensitiveselfemployed.com, and maybe see you soon. All right, bye.